Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
It's that time of the week again where we look at the opportunities and threats to investment on the African continent. Hello, I'm Nozi Pombandra and this is Invest Africa. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Now, in a 30-year period from the 1980s to now, about 1.3 trillion US dollars left Africa in illicit financial flows. Now, putting that number into perspective, it equates to as much as the current GDP of the continent. The figures back up the image of a corrupt continent. There certainly is money here, but it is being misappropriated to the detriment of Africa's economic growth story. But maybe let's take a look at some reports, starting off with one from the OECD. And what this report tells us is that Africa's illicit outflows actually are outweighing its inflows. If we take a look at inflows, and these are accounted for by aid as well as foreign direct investment, we put these figures together and you get 62.2 billion US dollars a year. Compare that to the outflows, and we're looking at trade mispricing as well as other forms of illicit outflows. We put that number together and we get 63.4 billion US dollars a year. Again, reinforcing that outflows are higher than inflows. Another interesting finding on this infographic is that trade mispricing is the biggest contributor to outflows on the continent. Let's take a look at what this looks like from a regional perspective. Regionally, sub-Saharan Africa sitting at 5.7% compared to other regions in the world. We see that we are higher than Asia, which sits at 4.1%, higher than all other developing countries at 4%. And this figure, this 5.7 figure, actually amounts to a loss of 50 billion US dollars each and every year. So as we can see, sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest culprit when it comes to illicit trade outflows globally. If we take a look at which sectors are causing Africa to bleed so much money, to my surprise too, illegal logging accounting for 17 billion US dollars every year. This is against the global average of 100 billion US dollars every year. And we're talking about the entire value chain, right from logging to transportation to the point of sale, as well as unreported and unregulated fishing. This is costing the coastlines $1.3 US billion a year compared to the global average of 23 billion US dollars a year. Clearly, the numbers and the figures speak for themselves. The continent of Africa is bleeding from corruption. Joining me now from Nairobi is Kwame Owino. He is the Chief Executive of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Kwame, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Let's maybe start off with getting an understanding of how serious is the threat of corruption and illicit trade flows to Africa's foreign direct investment.
Obviously it is. I think, I mean, as the numbers you've cited, and looking at even the areas you've cited, specifically fisheries and logging. And what it tells you, especially for logging, because this is very bulky stuff, so basically moving it out of the continent and obviously through the value chains without any income being paid, whether taxes or transfer pricing and all that, just tells you that systems are very, very weak. So definitely it's a major constraint, but it also suggests that corruption, which feeds off the weak systems, then presents a reinforcing cycle. And that for someone who's thinking about foreign direct investment, you come into that environment, so obviously it's a bit scary because you know systems are weak, and so whoever is thinking about coming in is a bit scared. So we have the timid money staying out of the continent because look, you want systems to work. If you're going to make foreign direct investments, means you're going to have to actually establish plans, and those give you the impression that this is not a very well managed place. Institutions probably don't work and they're very easily corruptible. So I think corruption, together with all these internal systems, before we talk about blaming foreigners, suggests to you that the problem is more internal than external.
Well, joining me at the desk here in Johannesburg is Cynthia Skuman. She is the Managing Director of Ethics Monitoring and Management Services. Cynthia, thank you for making the time to join us. We've heard what Kwame has said, and maybe let's zoom into that point he's made about governance. We often hear that Africa is turning the corner. We're seeing more good governance coming through. Is this really the case on the ground? Are we making the progress that we're reporting in all the glossy magazines?
We're certainly making progress in terms of economic progress, and I mean we're showing growth figures in Africa that I think parts of Europe would wish they had. But I think on the governance front, if we're looking at what statistics there are, they're still pretty poor. If one looks at a reliable source like Transparency International, and where they're looking at public sector corruption, the figures are really poor. They annually look at that, they put it onto a scale, and in the lower half of the scale where countries would be deemed to be more corrupt than others, sub-Saharan Africa, 90% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa fall in that lower half. Now, as I say, it ranges from, just a bit poor to really shocking, but that's a very worrying statistic. So while one doesn't want to deny that there is progress from a governance point of view, I think we unfortunately have a very long way to go.
Kwame, interesting points raised by Cynthia. I want us to maybe zoom in on the role of the public sector in fueling corruption in Africa, because to a large extent we talk about multinational corporations as being one of the biggest players, and you yourself has just said earlier, let's not be quick to blame the foreigners. Are we ourselves the root cause for corruption on the continent?
Well, I think especially talking about illicit financial flows, and the subject today, one of the things that arises is that you see that while systems are weak, I think many African countries, and certainly Kenya, has very sophisticated laws, too complex laws that in the first place give incentives. One, for somebody who works in the private sector, in the public sector, sorry, to solicit for money or actually use those laws to frustrate a business, which then provides some squeeze for this other person to have no choice but actually to pay. And the moment you've opened up that pipeline for corruption, obviously, it begins to roll over and the big money definitely starts to flow out. So I think first of all is just to make regulations very, very simple. Tax laws in the continent, again, I think are too sophisticated, or rather too complex. Whether by design or default is a different matter. But I think we must go for working systems and also to establish institutions that can be managed, and also tax systems that allow for, tax systems and obviously regulations that allow for simpler business processes. Because the moment you don't have that, then obviously you provide a big incentive, or rather you provide a big gap, which will also be filled by one public sector person or the other through bribes and all that. And then this money begins to go forward. So let's not bite more than we can chew.
Kwame, let me maybe interject, and I just want to make sure that Cynthia is also in agreement to the resolution that you're putting forward right now. Is it about simplifying the regulatory environment? Is that maybe the key to beginning to make sure that we're rooting out corruption?
I think that it's obviously useful to have a very clear set of regulations. If we look at South Africa, for example, I would argue that we have very good legislation in this country. I think it's perfectly clear. And let's be clear that whether it's corruption or other illegal and illicit activities, this is not because someone is unaware of the law, no matter how complicated it is. In most cases, unfortunately, it's a perfectly intentional act. The legislation, of course, exists as a mechanism that should curb that. But if I were looking at South Africa and at Africa, I'd say the issue we need to look at least as prominently, if not more so, is what are the lessons that our prominent leaders are sharing? And when, in fact, in our press there are examples of corruption, and when we find that the people who are being accused of this are not in fact being held responsible and accountable, then it really erodes the culture around those activities. And that for me is a much bigger issue rather than achieving, which is desirable, a greater clarity around the legislation.
Kwame, let me throw another question at you, and in particular looking at who's bearing the brunt of corruption across the continent. Who are we actually robbing when it comes to looting state coffers?
Well, it's obviously the small taxpayer and the small business person, basically, because one, these are the people who do not have perhaps access, and as you've just heard, these are the kind of people who are not able to evade prosecution or to evade some kind of stricter rules. So obviously they pay they pay for that because they cannot skive their taxes. Definitely, if their taxes are due, they'll be very easily caught, and if they're caught, obviously it will be a big message. It will be it could damage them financially. But for the other people who are able to, one, bribe their way out, or two, get corrupt court systems and other institutions to actually keep these cases, as happens in Kenya. You have a case that's run for 15 years when somebody's stolen hundreds of millions of dollars. And obviously over time, the evidence disappears and all that. So people who are connected definitely tend to have a good view. But what that does is that it transfers the burden of taxation, for instance, or the burden of supporting public services on smaller people and on the smaller people with incomes and those who are not as connected to politicians or to the institutions that enable these others to get away. Yeah.
Kwame, staying with you and maybe taking a step back to your earlier contribution around looking at the regulatory space, would you then suggest that looking at the judiciary as a starting point would go in some way towards looking for a solution for corruption?
Yes, I think there's a case to be made for the judiciary, and obviously a judiciary that is more aware about what these gaps are but that's not enough, partly because the judiciary deals with the level of evidence that is provided for them. And if you have a police force, which in our country you can't speak much for in terms of corruption, I think in the corruption and bribery leagues, they're always right at the top, then the judiciary is also hamstrung because somebody brings in a very, very deliberately weak case and it fails. So a judicial officer, even if they suspect something there's much more to it, but the case is weak, all they have to do is basically dismiss that case and make a very strong statement saying that, look, it looks like something should have happened, but obviously, or rather that further evidence should have been presented, but they can't go into the investigation themselves. So that's why I say it's a pipeline of things, starting from the investigation to the presentation of the case. Then obviously you need a stronger judiciary, which has a spine to actually stand up to politicians and the connected people. And sometimes there's subtle threats that go with that.
Yeah. Cynthia, here in South Africa, we've got our Chapter 9 institutions, which are supposed to be, one of the strongest pillars of our judicial system. And in particular, I want us to look at the role of the public protector. Do we just have toothless dogs in the country, or do we have real institutions that have the muscle to enforce their rights or their mandate?
Look, I think the public protector is a great example and one of our best examples of an institution that I think is extraordinarily effective. The reports they put out, they've been well researched and have been very revealing. The challenge we face, even currently around some of those reports, is the extent to which those reports are acted on. And while we can recognize the validity of the reports, if in fact they're not acted on, if we have a minister who is in fact contravening the recommendations, I think if not instantly, certainly over time, we'd be naive to think that it wasn't going to erode the power of that particular body.
Let's take a quick break on that note. When we come back, more on corruption and investment in Africa. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa. Tonight, we're looking at the impact that corruption is having on investment in the continent. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback, so send us an email. That's to investafrica@abn360.com, or talk to us on Twitter, following us at CNBC Africa or following me at Misappropriation. And don't forget that our hashtag is Invest Africa. Still with me, my guest, Cynthia Skuman, the MD of Ethics Monitoring and Management Services, and from Nairobi, Kwame Owino. He is the Chief Executive of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Let's start off in Johannesburg. Cynthia, we began to talk about who's bearing the brunt of corruption, but you're saying during the break that we actually need to make a very clear connection between corruption and the impact on the poor. Why?
The impact on the poor, they're often very, very severely affected. When we look at corruption, one of the consequences is that the full value of the funds is not put into, whether it is the infrastructure, whether it is the education, whether it is the healthcare. A huge portion of that is going off to line someone's pocket. So that's the first thing that erodes it. In other words, the money's being removed, but there's no productive outcome for it. So the services are then being compromised. And we can even take it into another level of detail, that when we're looking at infrastructure, if in fact too much money comes out of that, we risk things like inferior materials being used. Then of course we've got the safety ripple effect of that. So the issue when we're eroding public services is that often the people who are least able to afford it in their individual capacity are hugely affected.
Kwame, would citizen activism be a good response to this? And how do we get people taking on responsibility and accountability to make sure that funds that are due for infrastructure and other social developments are actually used for that?
Yeah, I mean, citizen activism has a place, partly, and often citizen activism is useful when there's transparency, and you know that systems that are corrupt or where, I mean, somebody wishes to make gains tend not to be as transparent as would be ideal. So activism definitely, I mean, to begin to demand those questions, I mean, to demand that those disclosures be made helps. But it's even better if there's information that allows for that advocacy and for that activism to be meaningful, because often it's very easy to dismiss by saying, look, these are just noisemakers or people who are idle for that reason or another. But I think the biggest part is basically audits. Auditing and strong and independent audit institutions are useful because they're able to actually demonstrate very, very clearly, not only that the money was not well used, but actually to then assign fault by saying, look, this is the person, whether it's the contractor or the person who was responsible for their supervision, in addition to providing the quantification of how much money has really been lost, because those are useful for then presenting these cases in court if that is required, or actually to make a demand that whether it's a contractor or somebody who's failed to provide services, then provide those services to or rather compensate by providing that money, refunding that money, or actually making sure that the infrastructure or whatever it is provided at the right level. So definitely activism on one side, but I think audit systems which need to be strengthened are another.
Kwame, I think you've led us into the next part of our conversation. I mean, up until now, we've really focused on public sector corruption and their role in all of this. But maybe let's look at the private sector. And I want us to maybe quickly tap in, Kwame, into tax evasion and to what extent this is also another hole where the continent is bleeding. And how do we fix it? How do we make sure that we're tightening on the tax laws so that we're not seeing this continue unabated?
I think one of the things that you consider is, again, tax evasion tends to happen because of very complicated rules, or where you have a tax system that is not simple. So a firm then invests, or a certain business person then invests in actually keeping their profits away from taxation, from legal taxation. And my view is one of the ways to do this is to make tax systems simple. I think the tax systems that you see in Africa and what I see in Kenya is far too complicated for the kind of economy that we have. It may be different for South Africa, but in Kenya, most of the economy is agro-based and it's based on many people, simple transactions here and there. So when you have systems that are too complicated and involve very many steps in reporting income, then obviously the first thing that happens is you give good leeway, and systems that are manual as well give leeway for somebody to actually, figure out a way to actually siphon money that should come in. So the approach in these countries tends to be to raise taxes to raise more money, when in some cases actually keeping taxes modest, but actually ensuring that there's even spread, and that business transactions are classified in a simple way as is possible, would probably be one of those ways. So simplifying the regulations, I think, still has some, is part of the solution here.
Cynthia, there's a lot of conversations that are going around in terms of the tax space, and in particular double taxation, and how do we leverage this so that there's a fair allocation of tax. Are we making headway? Are we beginning to see African governments tighten and implement pieces of legislation that are going to work in their favor and in the favor of the populations that they represent?
I'm not sure that there's massive advances in terms of African legislation, but I think that globally there are very sound moves in that regard. You know, the most recent G8 meeting was looking very much at establishing a far, far greater level of tax cooperation between different countries, at raising that level of awareness to try and close the loopholes where companies were juggling their profits one country to another, which of course is the classic issue of transfer pricing. And that, in fact, amounts to huge losses in terms of illicit financial outflows. And the cooperation that, as I say, one is seeing in the G8 is really excellent. What they're also saying is that, in fact, they should be aiding countries such as in Africa, where their legislation is perhaps not strong enough. They should be aiding them to, in fact, ensure that those funds do stay within the country, and we don't have some clever multinational moving their profits around, as they do within the organization, from one country to another, so that they can put it in the most profitable, if you want, tax regime for the company in terms of paying lower taxes.
One of the companies that I think is worth talking about, or the sectors worth talking about, is the extractive industries, because we talk about an African growth story that is diversified, but a large part of it is still around the resources. Have we learned the lessons we should have from our initial experiences, in particular looking at the oil industry in Nigeria? Have we learned from the so-called resource curse, and are we carrying those lessons through into new ways of governing resources?
Look, I think we're improving, and I think that is to be recognized. But I think we still have a long way to go. I think foreign ownership of many of the mineral resources is really a challenge if we're looking at retaining those finances in the country. And with foreign ownership, while of course there should be a two-way trade, they invest in ownership and they build capacity and jobs, in fact, we know that is not always a perfect correlation.
Kwame, coming to you with regards to the extractive industries, I mean, East Africa and Kenya in particular is one of those countries where on a daily we're hearing about new discoveries of gas in this field and that field. Do you get a sense that there's enough dialogue around policy and reviewing policy to make sure that the governance of those resources is to the benefit of the broader population?
I'm afraid not. I think because I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and among the things we've been tracking is these discoveries. And one of the first things that most governments in principally Ugandan and Kenya's government have done is there's not been sufficient disclosure about what exactly is the quantum of the fines. And that's really a bad signal, because once government starts to hide that information or is reluctant to actually release that information, you know what's coming next. You'll not be able to trace the finances. You'll not be able to look at the contracts and actually look at whether there's a fair mechanism, a transparent mechanism for actually ensuring that some of those funds, or rather that the funds and the revenues are shared adequately. So that's a bad sign in my view. Yes, but there's the common knowledge out there about how to do it, and transparency is definitely a requirement. Stronger systems of public finance management are also required. And the third point is not to treat revenues that come from extractives as a special form of revenue. But what we are seeing is new laws that try to treat these as special forms of revenue that will not necessarily go through the budget. And that again is a very bad sign. So we keep our fingers crossed. Of course, there's a lot to be done at this moment before the formative, in the formative moments before the extraction starts. But the model that I see the two countries in East Africa have taken, specifically Kenya and Uganda, are not the right ones in terms of disclosures and trying to ensure that everything is as above board as is possible.
And we'll come back to you, Kwame, very quickly before we go about what model you would propose that they should focus on. But before we do that, quickly, Cynthia, let's talk about this conundrum where the question is posed: which of the two evils is more palatable? Is it private sector corruption or is it public sector corruption?
Of course, let's be clear, they're both bad. But I think the distinction that should be recognized is that, in private sector corruption, that is likely to infect the investors, the various stakeholders. And if you were an investor, you could in fact choose to withdraw your money from that company and place it elsewhere. The challenge with the public sector is, of course, that if you think your government's corrupt, you don't get to choose to pay tax to an authority that you trust more. If you are, as many people in our country are dependent on public services, you don't easily get to afford to get that privately.
But there's a counter-argument that corruption in the public sector cannot happen without collusion of the private sector. It is the convergence of these two worlds that actually lead to this particular phenomenon.
And you're absolutely right, especially from a point of stopping it, that in fact either party can stop it by simply not engaging. I think, speaking as we were earlier to the smaller businesses, this is where I think one has to be clear. When the public sector contract is only available with a little something on the side, the large multinational has got much more influence to resist that. But the small contractor, in fact, is often sitting in a very tough position where literally the ongoing feasibility of the business may rest on getting that work.
We need to get you back when we talk about the new proposed tender process that the government has put on the table and how that will actually work. But before we do, let's go get our final comment from Kwame. Kwame, you said that you don't believe in the processes that Kenya and Uganda have adopted with regards to the new discoveries of gas in particular that they've made. What are you putting on the table?
I think a couple of things. One of those is basically, first, is never to make the distinction between the revenues that government receives from revenues that will be received from gas and oil as different from other tax revenue. I think they should be managed through the same public finance management project. I see initiatives in Kenya specifically trying to dissociate revenues from gas and oil as completely different from that. So I think that's the first thing. If that happens, I think the war will be lost too early. In fact, specifically the war in transparency and obviously in ensuring that the right revenues reach us. So that's the first. The second, I think, is not to necessarily mix too many objectives. Government has to make a choice about whether you want this sector to create jobs or whether you want as much revenues as are possible to use for supporting public resources, public services generally. When you mix these sources, you make for a very complex policy environment that, in my view, leads to losses one side. So I guess that, and the third one is basically, one, I think government needs to, some studies have been carried out in many countries, and one of the things that needs to be done is all these revenues don't necessarily have to vest with government, especially if they're substantial. There's a possibility that all taxpayers could actually receive tax cuts based on how much revenues come in from this. So there's nothing to prevent people from actually receiving directly cash or income or subsidies coming directly from the revenues that are received from petroleum or gas. It's happened in many other places, and I think in a country where people are very, very poor, the average income per capita is just about less than $1,000. If you're able to give maybe $100 to some poor people or some people directly to spend on their own according to their own judgment, so that would be favorable.
Unfortunately, Kwame, I have to wrap this up, but I think the point has been made, and I think those proposals that you put on the table are certainly valid in terms of opening up another debate for us to have a further discussion around this topic. Thank you so much to my guests. That's all we have time for tonight. Please don't forget to send us your comments. The details are on the screen. But for now, we have Bruce Whitfield, and he is standing by to bring you Tonight with Bruce. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye for now.